Pick that up, sweetheart." That is what Dr. Marcus Whitfield said 47 minutes before the Marine General coded in room 347. That is what he said while a patient chart lay at Natalie Hayes' feet and the cafeteria had gone so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum their sterile song. She was new to Seattle General, 3 days on the overnight ICU shift, where the senior physicians rarely ventured and no one asked too many questions about past lives or previous credentials. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and something deeper, something underneath, the particular staleness of a place where people fought death and sometimes won. Rain hammered the windows like applause, and somewhere down in the ER, an ambulance bay door slammed shut. Natalie moved through the corridors of the ICU like someone who had already survived the worst and found the rest manageable. Her hands, crossed with scars that told stories no one asked about, restocked medication carts with methodical precision. She knew the names of all the drugs before she pulled them from the automated dispensary. She knew which patients on which cardiac protocols would crash first based on their morning vital signs. Senior nurses, the ones with 7, 8, 10 years at Seattle General, already asked her opinion on difficult fours. They deferred to her judgment when a patient's pain management protocol wasn't working. She had been here 72 hours and somehow the hierarchy had already shifted around her presence, though she never asked it to. A pair of worn Marine combat boots sat in the bottom of her locker, size 13, leather cracked and salt-stained from Helm and Province dust. Not hers. Never hers. She kept them wrapped in a plastic grocery bag, the way you keep something sacred but cannot touch. Dr. Marcus Whitfield had built his reputation the way men like him always did, connections rather than competence. His father-in-law sat on the hospital board. His cases had complication rates 8.3% above the Seattle General average, a number that lived in a database no administrator seemed interested in examining. He wore suits that cost more than some nurses' car payments and carried himself like a man who had never been told no. But he was not stupid. He was watching Natalie, studying the way she moved through the ICU like water finding the lowest point, the way the veteran who worked security detail, a man named Clayton, who had the posture and bearing of someone who had seen combat zones, straightened his spine when she walked past. Whitfield leaned against the nurse's station on her third night, arms crossed, his gaze following her as she checked the flow rate on a PICC line in room 341. She did not look at him. She did not acknowledge his attention. This somehow made it worse, at least from his perspective. People were supposed to notice when Dr. Marcus Whitfield was watching them. "How long have you been in nursing?" His voice carried the particular tone of a man asking a question he already knew the answer to, the tone of someone setting a trap. Natalie finished adjusting the infusion pump before turning. Her voice, when it came, was quiet and professional, each word carefully measured. "Longest time possible, doctor." He smiled. It was not a warm expression. "That's not really an answer." "No, sir. It isn't." He waited for her to elaborate. She did not. Instead, she moved to the next patient's room, her steps neither hurried nor slow, the kind of movement that came from knowing exactly where you were going and why. Whitfield watched her go, his jaw tightening just barely, and something in his expression shifted. Not anger, exactly. Recognition. The recognition that this woman, this quiet, efficient woman who kept her eyes down and her past locked away, was somehow more comfortable in this ICU than he was, despite him being the chief of surgery, despite him holding the institutional power that came from board connections and inheritance. Despite him being the one people were supposed to defer to. In room 347, the Marine General lay in the adjustable bed, recovering from his third stroke in 18 months. His name was Harrison Drake. He wore his age like a uniform, each year carved into the lines of his face, and his left side was weaker now, the stroke having stolen fine motor control and most of his speech. He shuffled past the nurse's station during evening rounds, moving slow with his walker, his right hand gripping the aluminum frame with the kind of strength that suggested he had once moved through the world like a weapon. On his right forearm, visible when his hospital gown slipped, was a tattoo in faded ink, the name Hayes written in neat letters, done in a field medical station 15 years ago with ink and a needle and someone who knew they might not survive the night. Natalie did not look at the tattoo when she changed his for bag. She did not acknowledge it when she asked him questions about his pain level, his nausea, his appetite. His rheumy eyes, the blue-gray of Arctic water, passed over her face without recognition each morning. Brain damage had stolen that memory. The blast that took his hearing in his left ear had also taken the image of the corpsman who dragged him 2 miles through enemy fire in Helmand Province, the woman who had been 23 years old and had refused to leave him even when he ordered her to run, even when the bullets came so close the air itself seemed to tear. That memory was gone. That name, tattooed on his forearm as a promise and a prayer, belonged to a woman he no longer remembered. The cafeteria at Seattle General smelled like industrial coffee and something metallic underneath. Natalie was eating her lunch, a salad she had brought from home, the kind with precisely measured portions of protein and vegetables, when Dr. Whitfield walked past her table carrying a tray laden with fried food and a can of soda. He did not speak. He did not warn her. He simply, in one fluid motion that might have been accidental or might not have been, knocked the corner of her lunch tray with his hip as he passed, sending the plate and fork clattering to the tile floor with a sound like breaking glass. The salad scattered across the white surface in a pattern that almost looked intentional. The cafeteria went silent. Natalie did not stand immediately. She sat for exactly 2 seconds, her jaw tightening imperceptibly, before she rose and knelt to gather the scattered vegetables. Her hands moved with steady, practiced precision. A cherry tomato had rolled 3 feet away. She retrieved it with the same care she would use gathering medical equipment. Behind her, Whitfield set his tray down at the nearby table, and she heard him laugh, not out loud, but the kind of controlled laugh that was worse because it suggested he was already certain of the outcome of this interaction. Then he walked back toward her. She was still on one knee, gathering the last of the mess into the plastic plate. He tossed a patient chart onto the floor beside her, the pages spreading slightly. The chart hit the tile with a flat, disrespectful sound. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear it. The condescension was a blade. "You seem good at picking things up off the floor." Natalie's jaw clenched so tightly the muscle at the angle of her mandible became briefly visible. She did not respond. She did not look up at him. Instead, she reached for the chart with the same steady hands, gathered the scattered pages with methodical care, and tapped them back into order. The silence around them had spread like a stain. Other nurses were watching. 2 residents had stopped mid-conversation. Clayton, the security guard, had turned his head slightly, his posture shifting into something more alert. Natalie stood, holding the chart. "I'll return this to the records desk, Doctor." Her voice was so quiet it was almost respectful. That was the worst part, the respect. It was constructed perfectly, armor-plated, revealing nothing underneath. Whitfield's expression flickered, and for a moment he looked like a man who had expected a reaction and received none, which was somehow worse than any confrontation would have been. He turned away, returning to his tray, and Natalie walked out of the cafeteria with the chart held against her chest and her breathing perfectly controlled. The supply closet on the ICU was small and lined with boxes of gauze, syringes, and the 1,000 small necessities of critical care. Natalie stood inside for 17 seconds after closing the door, and her breathing changed. It came shallow and quick, her chest rising and falling in a pattern that suggested her heart rate had climbed toward 120. Her hands, the ones that had remained so steady in the cafeteria, began to tremble slightly. She pressed her forehead against a shelf of 4 bags and breathed in the smell of sterile packaging, and her jaw clenched so hard her teeth ached. Not from anger. Not from shame. From restraint. The trembling was not fear. It was the physical manifestation of someone holding back something larger than themselves, something that had been trained into submission over 15 years but had not died. The trembling was muscle memory fighting against discipline. 22 seconds later, she opened the door and returned to the ICU. Her hands had stopped shaking. Her breathing had returned to normal. She walked past Clayton, who gave her a look that suggested he had seen something in that moment, some flash of something else, but she did not acknowledge it. She walked past the nurse's station where a resident was standing, pretending not to have watched the cafeteria interaction. She walked to room 347 and checked on the Marine General, who was asleep, his tattoo visible where his gown had shifted, that name in faded ink that belonged to someone he would never remember. She did not know that in 4 hours and 43 minutes, his heart would stop. She did not know that 5 doctors would stand in this room and declare him beyond saving. She did not know that this chart, the one Whitfield had tossed at her feet, would contain the very information that everyone else would miss. She did not know that the rain outside would continue to hammer the windows like applause, like judgment, like the sound of something waiting to break. All she knew was that she could still feel the chart's weight in her hands. All she knew was that somewhere in this building, a man with her name tattooed on his arm was sleeping, and his dreams, if he still had them, did not include her face. The night shift stretched ahead of her like a country she had already crossed. The cafeteria at Seattle General hummed with the particular chaos of the lunch rush, the smell of industrial gravy and reheated chicken mixing with antiseptic that clung to everyone's scrubs, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like trapped wasps, the clatter of trays and the white noise of 200 conversations layered into something that felt almost like silence. Natalie Hayes sat alone at a corner table, her turkey sandwich halfway to her mouth, when Dr. Marcus Whitfield's voice cut through the ambient noise like a blade finding bone. People, listen up. He stood in the center of the cafeteria, near the dessert station, dressed in a suit that cost more than Natalie's car payment. His father-in-law's influence had dressed him well. His confidence came from somewhere deeper than money. It came from the bone-deep certainty that consequences were things that happened to other people, to people who didn't have the right last name, the right family tree, the right ability to make a single phone call and erase a problem. I want to introduce you all to our newest ICU nurse, Whitfield continued, his voice pitched to Carrie, his hand gesturing toward her table without looking in her direction. Natalie Hayes. Fresh meat. Night shift. 3rd day here. The cafeteria didn't go quiet, but Natalie felt something shift in its frequency. Conversations continued, but they became performance conversations, people maintaining plausible deniability while their attention swiveled toward her like a spotlight. She set her sandwich down. Did not look up. Now, I've been around long enough to know the types, Whitfield said, addressing the crowd but speaking about her as though she were already gone. New nurses hit the night shift with all this idealism, all this energy. They think they're going to save the world. And then reality hits them like a truck. The hours. The thanklessness. The actual weight of responsibility. He paused, letting the words settle like sediment. So here's what I'm thinking. I'm giving this one exactly 1 week. 7 days. That's when she quits. A few nervous laughs rippled through the room. Someone snorted into a cup of coffee. No, seriously, Whitfield continued, his voice taking on the cadence of someone warming to an audience. I'll put money on it. Who wants in? $5 says she doesn't make it to day 10. Several residents pulled their phones out. Venmo was open in seconds. The transaction notifications pinged quietly, $5 here, 10 there, accumulating like water dripping into a cup. Whitfield was collecting their small bets, their small cruelties, turning her into a joke that would be told in hallways and break rooms for weeks. Natalie picked her sandwich back up. Took a bite. The turkey tasted like nothing. She swallowed anyway. The thing about silence is that it can be a weapon or a shield depending on who's holding it. She had learned that in the desert, in FOB Shank where the Taliban watched the perimeter and words could carry 50 meters through still air and get you killed. She had learned that quiet was sometimes the only power you had left. But Whitfield didn't recognize power in quiet. He saw only an opening. He started walking toward her table, moving with the loose confidence of a man who had never once been told no in a way that actually stuck. Natalie watched him approach from her peripheral vision. She did not put her sandwich down. She did not make eye contact. She simply existed, a small fixed point in his expanding universe of entitlement. He drew level with her table. Hey, night shift Nancy, he said, his voice lower now but still loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear. "You keeping up okay? You look a little pale. Stress gets to people. Gets to fragile people especially." Natalie raised her eyes to his face for exactly 2 seconds. Held them there. Said nothing. His elbow came up, whether by accident or design, she would never quite believe it was accidental, and swept across the edge of her table. Her lunch tray went with it. Turkey sandwich, apple, juice box, plastic fork, napkin, all of it scattered across the tile floor with the sound of something breaking that wasn't quite broken but felt broken anyway. "Oops," Whitfield said. "Clumsy." He smiled at the nearby residents, at the audience he had assembled. "Sweetheart, looks like you've got some cleanup to do. Good practice for your future." Natalie's jaw tightened. Just barely. A tremor that lasted maybe a quarter second before she schooled her face back to professional neutrality. She stood without a word and knelt to collect the mess. The tile was still slightly wet from the morning cleaning, and she could smell the bleach underneath everything else, sharp and caustic, filling her sinuses. She picked up the sandwich. The apple. The juice box, which had mercifully remained sealed. Around her, the conversations resumed, but they were performance conversations now, too loud and too bright, everyone pretending they weren't watching. Whitfield dropped a patient chart at her feet. The folder smacked against the tile hard enough to make several people wince. It was a deliberate drop, not an accident, not even pretending to be an accident anymore. "Pick that up too, sweetheart," he said. "Multitask. They're going to expect that from you on night shift. Everyone does the job of 2 people." She picked up the chart. Her hands were steady. The chart had belonged to a woman in her 60s, post-op from a routine cholecystectomy, vital stable, pain controlled. She held the chart in one hand and the tray debris in the other and stood. Whitfield was still watching her, his eyes bright with something that looked like predatory interest. Like he was waiting for her to cry, to apologize, to give him something he could use. She met his gaze for 1 full second. Said only, "Yes, doctor," in a voice so quiet it required him to lean in slightly to hear it. Then she turned and walked to the trash receptacle near the exit. The cafeteria noise returned to normal gradually, like something waking up. Whitfield stood alone in the center of the room, still looking in the direction she had gone, his smile cooling slightly. She disposed of the trash. Wiped her hands on her scrubs. Continued her shift. 20 minutes later, outside the ICU, Whitfield was making rounds with a family who had come to visit their elderly mother. Natalie passed him in the hallway with a patient's blood pressure log. "You know, Mrs. Chen," Whitfield was saying to the wife, his voice taking on that particular tone, concerned, competent, the voice of a man who had never made a single mistake in his entire career. "Your mother's recovery really depends on having the right kind of nursing staff. Experienced staff. Some of the newer nurses, well, they just don't have the," he paused, searching for the word, fortitude for this kind of work. "The pressure breaks fragile people. I always tell them, if you can't handle it, home health might be better suited. Lower acuity. Less responsibility." He said it as she passed. She was sure of it because his voice rose slightly, pitched to reach her, though he did not turn to look at her. It was meant to land like a knife and stick there. Natalie continued walking. Her breathing remained steady. Her heart rate remained controlled. A technique from advanced interrogation resistance training, learned 15 years ago, became useful in a hospital cafeteria. Compartmentalize. Observe. Do not react. The reactions come later, in private. She made it through the rest of her rounds. It was during the supply closet restocking at 1,400 hours, that strange dead hour between lunch and dinner, when the hospital felt like a skeleton of itself, that her hands finally shook. She had her palms flat against the cold metal shelving, rows of 4 bags and sterile gloves and pericardiocentesis kit stacked neatly around her. The fluorescent strip light overhead hummed its frequency. Outside, the afternoon sun was making the parking lot shimmer in the heat. Her breathing came shallow. Quick! The kind of breathing that comes from adrenaline looking for an exit and finding none. She pressed her forehead against the metal shelf. Cold. Smooth. Unyielding. 30 seconds. That's all she allowed. 30 seconds for the reaction, then it had to go back in the box. The compartment. The place where you stored the things that would kill you if you looked at them directly. She straightened. Her hands were steady again. She looked down and saw that she had left forehead marks on the shelf, a small impression of her skin against the metal. She wiped it away with her sleeve. By 1800 hours, the night shift began to settle over the hospital like a change in pressure. The afternoon crew handed off their patients to the night crew. Reports were given in brief, clipped sentences. Natalie took room 347 again. It was becoming hers now, the way certain patients or rooms claimed certain nurses, and made her first assessment of the evening. The Marine General sat propped against 3 pillows, his left side still slightly weakened from the last stroke, his eyes tracking across the room without quite landing on anything. The television was on low volume. Some cooking show. He didn't seem to be watching it. She checked his vitals. Temperature 37.1. Blood pressure 118/78. Heart rate 72. Everything stable. Everything normal. She made notes in his chart and prepared his evening medications. As she was about to leave, he stirred slightly. "You," he said, his voice rough from non-use. "You're always here." She paused at the doorway. When she turned back, he was looking at her face, really looking, his eyes focusing with effort. "Night shift," she said simply. "That's my rotation." "Good nurse," he said. Then his eyes lost focus again, sliding away into the middle distance. "Good nurse." That's good." His forearm rested on top of the blanket, the tattoo visible, her name in faded ink from a time when he had thought she might die and wanted to carry her name with him if she did. She looked away first. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came at 0300 hours, when the cardiac monitor in room 347 suddenly accelerated from its steady rhythm into something wrong, something compressed, something like an animal trying to escape from a cage made of bone. The alarm screamed. The cardiac monitor in room 347 didn't scream so much as shout. A sound like nothing else in medicine, the high-pitched wail of a heart drowning in its own fluid, each beat compressed and muffled as if the general's chest had turned to concrete. 3 in the morning. The witching hour when the body's defenses collapse and machines become truth-tellers. Natalie was 3 beds away restocking the medication cart when the alarm registered in her brainstem before her conscious mind caught up. She moved. No hesitation. The unconscious acceleration of someone whose hands had learned what her voice would never say, that she had done this before, in conditions far worse than fluorescent lights and clean linoleum. Room 347. The general lay supine, his breathing shallow and rapid, the kind of respiration that meant the body knew it was suffocating even if the brain hadn't caught up yet. Distended neck veins. Blue lips fading toward gray. His blood pressure on the monitor showed the numbers dropping like a stone down a well, 92/58. 87/52. The oxygen sat at 91 and falling. Muffled heart sounds. Natalie leaned in, stethoscope already around her neck before anyone else arrived, and heard what she expected, the dull thud-thud of a heartbeat trying to work inside a sac filling with blood. Cardiac tamponade. The pericardium, the membrane surrounding the heart, had filled with fluid. The general's heart was being strangled from the inside. 5 doctors converged on room 347 within 90 seconds. Dr. Whitfield arrived first, his face already arranged in the expression of someone who had already decided the outcome. Dr. Chen from cardiology came next, followed by Dr. Patel, Dr. Morrison, and Dr. Reeves from trauma. 5 physicians. 5 sets of hands that could have saved him. 5 minds that looked at the monitors and the distended veins and the failing pressure and made a choice. "It's too advanced," Whitfield said. "Not a question. Not a consultation. A pronouncement." His voice carried the flat certainty of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "The tamponade's been building for hours. There's no reversing this trajectory." Dr. Chen nodded slowly, his mouth set in a thin line. "Agree. The fluid volume is substantial. Pericardiocentesis at this point would be," he paused, choosing his words with the careful precision of someone who had learned to speak in the passive voice. "Interventions are unlikely to alter the outcome." Dr. Patel was already backing toward the door. "I'll call the family." Dr. Morrison and Dr. Reeves exchanged a glance that needed no words. They were already walking away, their white coats moving toward the hallway with the practiced ease of men who had seen hundreds of patients die and learned to shed the weight of it like water off a goose. They didn't look back. Whitfield stayed long enough to touch the general's arm, a gesture that might have been compassion if his eyes hadn't been calculating the liability exposure. Then he turned to leave. "Make him comfortable," he said to nobody in particular. The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator's mechanical wheeze, steady and useless. Natalie stood alone at the bedside while 5 doctors retreated down the hallway toward the call room and the paperwork that would explain how they had done everything possible and nothing at all. She reached for the pericardiocentesis kit without thinking. The motion wasn't a decision, it was muscle memory of a different kind, the kind forged not in hospitals but in the back of a destroyed Humvee with rotor wash shaking the doors and sand working its way into every crevice of her uniform, including the spaces between her ribs where her heart lived. Betadine. The smell of it brought something forward from deep storage, not quite memory, more like a script her hands had memorized. She prepped the subxiphoid area, the soft spot beneath the ribcage where the pericardium lay vulnerable to anyone with the knowledge to reach for it and the courage not to hesitate. Her fingers located the anatomical landmarks, the xiphoid process, the angle of the ribs, the space between. The general's monitor read 78/42 now. His oxygen sat was 84 and dropping. She had minutes. Maybe less. The needle felt light in her hands, 14-gauge angiocath, sterile, the weight of it familiar even though it had been 15 years since she had held one like this. She advanced it beneath the xiphoid process at a 45-degree angle toward the left shoulder, the technique practiced twice in the back of the Humvee in Helmand Province when the medevac birds were delayed and her hands were all that stood between a dying lieutenant and the certainty of his name on a memorial wall. The needle entered the pericardial sac with a sensation like breaking through a membrane, which, of course, it was. She aspirated. Dark blood filled the syringe, the color of old pennies, the color of ours. 20 cc. Her thumb on the plunger, steady. 60 cc. The general's eyes were closed but his breathing had shifted, shallower, more rapid, the pattern of someone whose body was beginning to understand the difference between suffocation and drowning. 120 cc. The monitor beeped. Once. A single tone that cut through the room like a bell. Pressure rising. 95/60. Then 110/70. His lips began to pink. The gray was receding. His eyes moved beneath closed lids, REM sleep or something close to consciousness, the first sign that blood was actually reaching his brain again. She withdrew the needle with the same precision she had used to insert it, applied pressure to the site, taped the dressing, and stepped back. His vitals climbed steadily across the monitor, oxygen 94, then 96, then 98. Sinus rhythm. A normal heartbeat, strong and even, the rhythm of a man whose pericardium had just been relieved of the weight that was crushing him. The general's fingers twitched. His eyes opened. Confusion first, then the slow return of something like recognition. "Water," he whispered. Natalie was already reaching for the cup on the bedside table when she heard the footsteps. Whitfield returned to room 347 with a family member in tow, an older woman, likely his wife, her face arranged in the expression of someone preparing to say goodbye. Her eyes went to the monitor, to the steady beat of a heart that was beating, to her husband's face, now conscious and breathing, his lips moving to form the word water again. Whitfield's face went through 3 colors in succession. White first, like something had been drained from him. Then red, the color of rage rising from deep in the chest. His jaw clenched so tight Natalie could see the muscles working at his temples. "What did you do?" His voice was quiet. Dangerous. The kind of quiet that precedes something breaking. "Pericardiocentesis, doctor." Natalie's voice remained level, professional, the voice of a nurse reporting her actions during a procedure. The tamponade was compressing his heart. The fluid aspiration relieved the pressure. "His vitals have stabilized. I gave you a direct order." He stepped closer. His presence did something to the air pressure in the room, made it denser, heavier, the way an approaching storm changes the weight of the atmosphere. "I made a clinical judgment. 5 physicians agreed on the prognosis. You are a nurse. You countermanded the clinical judgment of 5 attending physicians." She didn't answer. The answer wasn't the point. The silence was the point, and she held it the way someone holds a rope, with all her strength, because the moment she let go everything would unravel. He turned to Dr. Chen, who had reappeared in the doorway. "Document this. Everything. Patient presentation, our assessment, our decision to provide comfort care, and the fact that the nursing staff intervened without authorization." He pulled his phone from his coat pocket and stepped into the hallway. Through the open door, Natalie heard fragments: emergency board meeting, credential verification, liability exposure, investigate every chart she's touched in the past 3 weeks. His voice rose slightly on that last phrase, as if the volume of his anger might lend weight to whatever he was about to do. The general's wife was holding his hand, tears moving down her face, her husband's fingers squeezing hers with the strength of someone who had just been given back something she thought she had lost. She looked at Natalie with an expression of such raw gratitude that for a moment everything else, the hall, the monitors, the machines, seemed to fade. "Thank you," the woman whispered. "Thank you. Thank you." Natalie adjusted the 4 and checked the dressing without responding. There would be time for words later. Or there wouldn't be, depending on what Whitfield was planning on that phone call. She had just saved a man's life by acting on knowledge she wasn't supposed to have, skill she wasn't supposed to possess, judgment she wasn't supposed to exercise. She had blown the mask wide open. And there was nothing she could do about it now except wait for the consequences to arrive. Dr. Whitfield's shoes hit the polished floor at 0347 with a sound like a judge's gavel. He'd stepped out of room 347 exactly 4 minutes earlier, clipboard in hand, already composing the family notification call in his head. The general was finished. 5 doctors had concurred. 5. That was the consensus, that immovable block of institutional agreement that made every decision irreversible. Whitfield loved that feeling. Authority by committee meant no single neck to hang. He was 30 yards down the corridor, moving toward the family consultation room, when the monitors began screaming. His stride broke. He turned. The sound of footsteps, rapid, purposeful, moving toward the general's room instead of away from it, registered in his brain at the same moment the first alarm cut out. Then the second. Then the third, shutting down in a sequence that made no clinical sense. You didn't silence alarms. You addressed the crisis. Whitfield's hand found the doorframe of room 347. What he saw inside stopped him mid-breath. Natalie stood at the bedside with the pericardiocentesis kit. Not opening it. Already opening it. Her movements had a precision that made his surgical training feel like a blunt instrument. The needle was already in her hand. The general's chest was already prepped. She wasn't assembling equipment, she was executing a procedure she'd already done 1,000 times before, muscle memory taking over, her hands moving with the terrifying fluid grace of someone for whom this wasn't medicine, it was muscle memory. The needle went in. Beneath the xiphoid process. Exactly where it belonged. A hiss of air escaping the pericardial sac. Rusty blood followed, dark as old pennies, draining into the collection chamber. 100 ccs. 120. Her left hand never wavered. Her right hand monitored the patient's radial pulse. The general's blood pressure was climbing. 72. 84. 91. Stable. 20 seconds from monitor alarm to sinus rhythm. Whitfield's vision tunneled. His hands, which had performed 600 surgical procedures, felt suddenly useless. Decorative. He'd left this man to die. 5 doctors had left this man to die. And a nurse, not even a senior resident, not even a credentialed surgical tech, but a nurse who'd been employed here for 72 hours, had reversed it with a needle and 14 seconds of competence. "Call interventional cardiology," Natalie said. Her voice was level. Measured. The voice of someone reporting weather conditions. "The general needs a cardiothoracic consult for pericardial window. Pending imaging, keep him on continuous monitoring. I'll be with him until cardiology arrives." She didn't look at Whitfield. Didn't acknowledge his presence in the doorway. Simply moved to the bedside and began documenting the procedure with the methodical precision of a person for whom paperwork was a secondary language. Whitfield's breathing had gone shallow. His hands were fists. By 0500, he'd made 3 phone calls. The first to his father-in-law, chairman of the board. The second to Seattle Grace Hospital, the number for Natalie's previous employment listed on her application. The third to an outside investigator, the kind hospitals called when insurance risk management required someone expendable to hold the blame. The board meeting convened at 0630 in the executive conference room on the 5th floor. Whitfield had spent 20 minutes alone before it started, rehearsing his narrative. A nurse performing advanced procedures outside her scope of practice. A patient who should have been allowed to expire with dignity instead of surviving to potential complications. A safety violation so clear, so egregious, that it required immediate credential review. His voice was steady. Controlled. The voice of a man protecting his institution. She had no credentials verification, Whitfield said. No documented training in invasive procedures. No supervising physician. She simply took it upon herself. Her previous hospital checks out, the chairman interrupted. He'd pulled the background report from his folder. Seattle Grace confirms her nursing background. Clean record. Multiple commendations. Whitfield's jaw tightened. But he'd anticipated this. Did they confirm she has no advanced certification in emergency procedures? The chairman had paused. Called the number again, speaking with someone in the credentialing department. The conversation lasted 3 minutes. When he hung up, something had changed in his expression. "They're saying the number I called routes to a general information line. No one in credentialing remembers her being contacted before." Whitfield leaned forward. "That's the point. She's represented experience she doesn't have. The question isn't whether she saved the general's life, she clearly did. The question is whether an uncredentialed person performing invasive procedures puts this hospital at liability. Whether we can trust her to understand scope limitations going forward." By 0830, Whitfield had convinced risk management to bring in the outside investigator. A woman named Judith Carver, 63, with the demeanor of a dental hygienist and the predatory instinct of someone who'd spent 30 years finding the one thread that unraveled entire personnel files. She was already cross-referencing Natalie's documentation from the past 3 weeks, chart by chart, flagging inconsistencies that Whitfield had carefully constructed, small ones, undetectable to casual review, but mounting in aggregate. A medication dose documented before the order was written. A patient vitals reading that preceded the monitor timestamp by 11 minutes. Nothing provable. Everything suggestive. By 0915, Natalie's credentials were suspended pending investigation. By 0945, security was walking her out of the building. Whitfield watched from the second-floor window as she descended the front steps, badge already deactivated, her locker emptied into a cardboard box that a security guard carried. She moved without hurrying. Didn't look back. The June morning was humid enough to see her breath, though that might have been something else, something internal, something that no longer needed to hide behind professional composure. She'd tried to protest. Once. Quietly, in the HR office, asking what the investigation was reviewing, what specific violations they documented. The director, a woman named Patricia who'd worked with Whitfield for 8 years and understood the value of not asking too many questions, had simply shaken her head. "We need to verify your credentials, Ms. Hayes. Until that process completes, you're on suspension. You'll be contacted." Natalie had nodded, accepted the suspension letter, understood immediately what Whitfield had done, and understood why she couldn't fight back. Naval intelligence didn't acknowledge its assets, didn't confirm cover identities, didn't intervene in civilian employment disputes, especially not when the asset's mission remained incomplete. 3 years of her life had been spent building the backstory that now sat in Seattle Grace's credentialing database, 3 years of someone in a federal office calling hospitals and planting records, creating a nursing history that would hold up to casual review but collapsed under intentional scrutiny. That same office would not help her now. Couldn't help her. To do so would be to confirm that she was something other than a nurse, which would blow the operation wide open. The Marine General was still in his hospital bed, still unaware that the woman who'd carried him for kilometers through Helmand Province's deadliest valley had just been ejected from his care. The war crime contractor was still running for Senate. The evidence still waited for testimony that only the general could provide, testimony that required him to be conscious, healed, and willing to go on record about what he'd witnessed in Sanjin District 15 years ago. All of that was now impossible. Natalie's Honda Civic sat in the parking garage, 3rd level, spot 304. The car was older than her military service, a decade of ownership from a time before Seattle General, before the cover identity, before she'd become someone whose entire existence was footnoted in classified briefing documents. She sat in the driver's seat with the door open, feet still touching the asphalt outside, forehead pressed against the steering wheel. The heat was already building. Morning in Savannah, June, 0952 hours. In an hour the temperature would push 90. In the rearview mirror, the trunk was visible, and through the trunk's open hatch, a pair of boots sat in the shadows. Size 13. Marine issue. The leather was cracked from exposure, the laces still stained with sand from Helmand Province that refused to wash out completely. She'd carried those boots for 15 years, moving them between her apartment and whatever assignment came next, keeping them in the bottom of her locker like a talisman. The general had been wearing them when she found him bleeding out from shrapnel wounds, his right leg below the knee nearly severed, his blood already turning the sand dark. She'd carried him. Carried the boots. Carried them both through hostile territory for 4 kilometers while calling in danger close air support that killed every living thing for 200 meters in every direction except for her and the Marine she was dragging by the collar. 15 years. Waiting for him to wake up and recognize her. Waiting for him to remember. Her phone buzzed against the center console. Naval intelligence checking in. Status update. Mission progress. She didn't answer. Didn't pick it up. Just let it vibrate into silence. Whatever she said now would be logged, analyzed, reported to handlers in offices she'd never see in a building she'd never enter again. The steering wheel was hot under her forehead. She'd been sitting this way for 6 minutes when the first tear fell, though her face remained perfectly still, her breathing steady, her hands resting on her thighs without trembling. The tear simply happened, the way weather happened, not because she willed it, but because her body was still subject to physics and gravity and the accumulated weight of decisions made in offices where she had no voice. She had no official recourse. No way to appeal a suspension without revealing that her credentials were created by a government agency. No way to fight Whitfield without blowing her cover and killing an investigation that would, if successful, put a war criminal in prison for life. The math was simple. The general's career didn't matter. Her career didn't matter. What mattered was testimony from a witness who currently had no idea he was a witness to anything except his own survival. 20 minutes. That's how long she sat before she finally turned the key and felt the engine rumble to life beneath her, a car held together by hope and WD-40 and the same kind of stubborn refusal that had kept her alive in Helmand Province. She put it in reverse and backed out of the parking space slowly, carefully, like someone driving for the first time since waking from a coma. She didn't know what came next. Didn't have the information to know. All she knew was the weight of the combat boots in her trunk, the general's name tattooed on her skin in reverse, visible only when she looked in the mirror, and the fact that some wars don't end when you leave the battlefield. Some wars wait. 3 days later, a Taliban commander shuffled into Seattle General's emergency room on feet that weren't his own anymore, amputations above the ankle, both sides, guided by a State Department escort who held paperwork that nobody wanted to read too closely. Natalie was restocking the medication cart on the 3rd floor when she heard the commotion downstairs, the kind of controlled chaos that came with federal presence, but she kept moving, muscle memory taking over. Hands found their place. Bottles aligned. That was the job, the cover, the mask that had held for months now. But then the elevator doors opened on the ICU corridor. The Taliban commander's eyes found her first. Recognition. Not curiosity. Not confusion. The kind of recognition that came from staring at someone across a rifle sight for 6 seconds before they moved, before they saved your prisoner, before you spent 15 years wondering if that woman would ever step foot in a place where you could see her face without sand and blood covering it. His mouth opened. His voice dropped to Pashto, words that rattled like shrapnel in the hallway's fluorescent silence. The Wolf of Helmand. He spat. The phlegm hit the floor tiles 3 feet from her boot. His handler stiffened. Natalie didn't flinch. She didn't pause. She placed one final syringe in its slot and turned toward the medication room, every movement the speed of someone who had done this 10,000 times before. That was when the security guard went rigid. His name was Holloway, ex-Marine, 1st Battalion 5th Marines, Dark Horse Company. She'd learned that in week 2 from the tattoo on his forearm and the way he moved through the hospital like he was still scanning for IEDs. He stood at the ICU nursing station, watching the Taliban commander being escorted past, and his entire body stiffened into a shape that Natalie recognized. The shape of remembering. The shape of understanding. His hand moved to his radio. But he didn't use it for a distress call. He raised his voice instead, and it carried down the corridor with the weight of formal military protocol. Master Chief on deck. The words hung in the air like smoke. Nurses stopped mid-conversation. A resident looked up from a chart. The Taliban commander's handlers exchanged glances. In room 347, the Marine general had been shuffling past on his walker, 3 weeks into his recovery, moving with the careful precision of someone whose left side still didn't quite believe in cooperation. He stopped. His walker's rubber feet squeaked against the floor. His head turned. And his eyes, the right one still drooping slightly from the stroke, the left one clear as ice water, locked onto Natalie's face with the sudden, terrible clarity of memory flooding back all at once. He opened his mouth. What came out wasn't a question. It was recitation, the way a man recites something he's carried for 15 years without knowing it was there, something his brain kept trying to show him every time he saw her name on his own arm. Master Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes. Helmand Province, Sanjin Valley, 2009. Neutralized 6 hostile combatants with a PSI-down while under active fire. Stabilized 3 Marine casualties with field medicine performed while exposed. Carried this old bastard for kilometers through enemy territory while calling in close air support that saved 37 lives. His voice grew louder. Not angry. Just true. Navy Cross. For extraordinary heroism. You were 23 years old, and you wouldn't leave me. Even when I ordered you to run. He stepped forward. His walker clattered to the floor. Holloway moved toward him, and the general raised one hand, a command that Holloway obeyed without thinking, the way muscles remember things the mind forgets. He stood there in his hospital gown and his compression socks, a 68-year-old Marine with a fresh scar running down his sternum from his 3rd stroke, and he met Natalie's eyes like he was seeing her for the first time. I remember now, he said. I'm sorry it took 5 doctors telling me you weren't good enough to make me stop and actually look. The room went dead silent. Complete. The kind of silence that comes when the entire architecture of who people thought they were crumbles into something else entirely. The Taliban commander's escort shifted uncomfortably. A nurse dropped a pen and didn't pick it up. Somewhere down the corridor, the heart monitor in a patient's room beeped its steady rhythm like nothing had changed, like the world hadn't just pivoted on its axis. That was when the hospital chairman walked out of Dr. Whitfield's office with his face the color of wet concrete. He'd been there, in the office with the investigator, reviewing documents that had started as a simple background check on Natalie Hayes and somehow ended up cataloging every surgery Dr. Marcus Whitfield had performed in the last 3 years. The chairman moved toward the ICU like a man walking through water, and he stopped beside Natalie without saying a word at first. He was looking at the general. He was looking at the Taliban commander. He was looking at the recognition on every face in the corridor. Then he spoke quietly, his voice the kind of quiet that made people listen harder than if he'd shouted. The investigator I hired to destroy a decorated war hero just found something interesting. 15 surgical cases. All with Dr. Whitfield listed as primary. All using devices from MedTech Solutions. Devices that the surgical report said had 0 complications. The devices themselves told a different story. Perforations. Infections. One hemorrhage requiring emergency reoperation. He pulled a folder from under his arm. His hands were shaking slightly. The same company paid for his conference trips. Maui. Aspen. Consulting fees that don't exist, payments routed through subsidiaries. The investigator says it's healthcare fraud. Possibly criminal. He's already contacted the state medical board. Whitfield appeared in the doorway of his office, his face changing in real time. The arrogance drained first. Then the confusion. Then something worse, the understanding that the weapon he'd built had turned itself around. I didn't, those cases were complicated, he started, but the chairman had already pulled his phone from his pocket. He dialed. He waited. He gave Whitfield's name and medical license number. He read directly from the investigator's report while Whitfield stood there in his press shirt and his $800 tie, watching his career evaporate in the time it took to say falsified surgical reports and federal referral. The state medical board moved fast once federal healthcare fraud was mentioned. By end of business, Whitfield's license was suspended pending full investigation. Federal agents arrived the next morning at 6:15 and sealed his office. His wife, the chairman's daughter, filed for divorce by Thursday. His consulting agreements dissolved. His speaking engagements cancelled. His reputation, carefully built over 20 years of lying and climbing and stepping on people quiet enough not to fight back, collapsed in 72 hours. 6 months later, Natalie Hayes walked through Seattle General's ground floor on her way to her office, ICU Director, a position the hospital created specifically for her after the General's recovery and his testimony about the contractor now serving 8 years in federal prison for war crimes. Her credentials, cleared retroactively by naval intelligence, had become public record enough that everyone in Savannah knew what she'd been. What she was. She passed the main lobby where Marcus Whitfield sat at a folding table wedged between the pharmacy and the coffee shop. The table was cheap, the kind you'd find at a flea market or a bankruptcy auction. Folded across it were pamphlets for supplemental insurance. He was mid-pitch to an elderly woman who looked deeply uncomfortable, his voice carrying the desperation of someone who'd learned that the world doesn't care about your credentials once they stop believing in your character. He saw Natalie. His mouth opened. She didn't break stride. Didn't acknowledge him. Didn't even slow. She simply walked past like he was part of the floor, which, in a way, he was now. Upstairs in her office, the General's combat boots sat in a shadow box mounted on the wall beside her Navy cross, still carrying helm and sand in the treads. The plaque beneath read ICU Director Natalie Hayes, Master Chief Petty Officer, USN, Ret. She'd earned that rank in the dirt. She'd earned it dragging a man through enemy fire. She'd earned it being quiet when she could have been loud, being patient when she could have been angry. Being human when the world gave her every reason to be something harder. The General appeared in her doorway that afternoon, moving without the walker now, his left side responding better every week. He carried 2 cups of coffee. Strong. Black. No sugar. The way they'd both learned to drink it at 23 years old in a place where comfort was measured in milliliters of water and the sound of your own heartbeat meant you were still alive. Still can't believe you kept my boots for 15 years, he said, settling into the chair across from her desk. You kept my name on your arm, she replied. Seemed fair. He tapped the tattoo. The ink was old now, faded almost to nothing except for the 2 letters, NH wasn't going to forget twice. He smiled. It was the kind of smile that came after surviving things that should have killed you. You know what the worst part was? Trying to figure out why I felt like I owed someone my life and not being able to remember who that someone was. She looked at the photo on her desk, her old unit, 23-year-old Natalie in desert fatigues, before the promotion, before the scars, before the nightmares that still came every 3rd Tuesday or so. Before she learned that the real war wasn't about winning. It was about keeping the people next to you alive long enough to see what you both could become afterward. The general left after 40 minutes, after talking about his physical therapy and his daughter's wedding and the fact that he'd started volunteering at the VA. After he was gone, Natalie sat alone in her office and looked at those boots. At the medal. At the name on the plaque. And she thought about something he'd said last week, something that had stuck to her like helm and dust. The ones who have seen the worst often give the most. She was giving now. Not as a shadow. Not as a nurse with a hidden past. As Natalie Hayes. Master Chief Petty Officer. Director. The one who would make sure that what happened to her, what happened to the general, what happened to the 5 doctors who walked away from a patient because the system told them he was disposable, that it wouldn't happen again under her watch. Subscribe to the channel for more stories of hidden strength and quiet heroism. Like this video if you believe the quietest people often hold the most power. And comment below, would you have saved him? Or would you have walked away?